Moving to the example that came from Ricardo, it is important to be able to understand this table. This table is different from the one we did earlier in lecture week 1. In this table, this is the amount of laborers you need to produce food and carbon, meaning you need 2 laborers to produce 1 food for the EU, United Nations, and we need 8 laborers to produce 1 carbon for the EU. And similarly for Kenya, you need 4 laborers to produce 1 food, and you need 24 laborers to produce 1 carbon. So let's first see who has absolute advantage. So in this case, because we're producing 1 food and 1 carbon, we're doing 1 production, we need to see who uses the least amount of laborers to produce that, to find what absolute advantage is here. So the EU has absolute advantage in terms of food because it uses only 2 laborers to produce 1 food, compared to the 4 used by Kenya. And similarly for chemicals, we find that the EU uses only 8 laborers compared to 24 used by Kenya. So the EU has comparative advantage in both food and carbon. And we know, according to the Ricardian model, that they can still be traded, but under the Smith model, because absolute advantage is for both the EU here in both products, there is no trade. So based on the Ricardian model, we're going to work out what are the trade-offs for carbon or food in that. So let's see what it does to produce 1 carbon. How many food must be sacrificed for the EU? So if you need to produce 1 carbon, you need 8 laborers. So to gain 8 laborers, you have to sacrifice 4 food, because each food is 2. This is to produce 1 carbon. To produce 1 carbon, you need 8 laborers. They have to come from the food industry from the EU, and it takes 2 laborers to produce 1 food. So in essence, to get 8 laborers, you have to give up 4 food to get the 8 laborers to produce this 1 chemical. For Kenya, to produce the 1 carbon, what do you need? Okay, so you need 24 laborers to produce 1 carbon. How much, or 1 chemical? Sorry if I'm using carbon and chemical interchangeably here. So 24 laborers is needed to produce 1 chemical. You need to get it from the food industry, and each food is only 4. So to get to 24, you need 6 foods, because 6 times 4 is going to give you the 24. So who needs to give up the least amount to produce chemicals? To produce 1 chemical, EU only needs to give up 4 food. But to produce 1 chemical, Kenya needs to give up 6 food. So comparative advantage in terms of chemicals is the EU. So when it's in terms of laborers as short, a quicker way for you to do this is just to take carbon over food, and this is equal to 8 over 2, and that gives you 4. So that is 4 food sacrificed per carbon per chemical. 4 food sacrificed per chemical. This is when you're trying to work out your terms of trade, in other words, which is exactly the same thing we've done in terms of lift when we try to discuss it as replacement labor. And then similarly for the calculation for Kenya, in terms of finding the terms of trade for carbon or chemicals, would be 24 Same calculation over 4, which is equal to 6. That it means 6 food per chemical. Similarly, you can do this to find out who has comparative advantage in terms of food. So we're going to do the short calculations. If you need comparative advantage in terms of food for Kenya, in terms of the calculation, it's going to be food over chemicals, which is going to be 4 over 24, which is equal to 1 over 6. So that's 1 over 6 chemicals you need to give up per one food to produce one food. Similarly, you can do this for the EU, and when you do that for the EU, you're going to find your answer is 2 over 8, which is a quarter. So that's a quarter carbon you have to give up to produce one food. So the smaller fraction between the two here is 1/6. So therefore, in terms of comparative advantage in terms of food, Kenya would have the advantage. Okay, so this is your basics. This you should know from the time they taught you trade in that. And this, we're going to move to the next part of this calculation. So now we're going to move to a hypothetical now. Suppose Kenya produces one less chemical. So what is happening? They're producing one less chemical. So they're decreasing the chemical production by 1. What does it mean? How many laborers are now free? If they produce one less chemical, they are freeing up 24 laborers. What does that mean in terms of what they can produce in terms of food? Remember, the laborers can only move towards food. So there's 24 laborers. Each of them, 4 of them is needed to produce one food. So if 4 laborers produce one food, the amount of food you can now produce with 24 laborers would be 24 divided by 4, which is equal to 6. So one carbon less, or one chemical less produced is 6 food. That's what you get. This is what they're able to do. What's the problem they want to? They're thinking, but we still want the same amount of carbons. What happens if we import this one carbon from the EU? So they ask the EU, make us one extra carbon. So in terms of the EU, they will increase their production by 1 carbon. What does that mean? What do they have to give up? Remember here, for Kenya, they reduced the thing by 6 carbon and they were able to produce 6 food. Now what's happening? They're trying to produce 1 carbon in the EU because Kenya has asked maybe for 1 carbon and the EU doesn't want to have less carbon than what they had before. So they don't want to give up on what they had before. They said, okay, we'll produce the 1 extra to give to what's Kenya. So this 1 carbon extra means they have to sacrifice from the food industry. To produce 1 carbon, they need 8 laborers. This is what they need. They need 8 laborers. So that 8 laborers must come from the food industry. But each laborer, or they need 2 laborers to produce 1 food. So that would mean they have to give up 4 food. Each laborer, 2 of them are needed to produce 1 food, and that would give you 4 food. Reduced. So their 1 carbon increase in production will result in 4 food that they need to give up for the EU. What happened for Kenya? Kenya said we don't want to produce, or we're going to produce one less carbon, and that would mean we gain 6 food. What happens in total if you're looking in terms of total? What happens in terms of carbon? In terms of the whole world? Previously, Kenya reduced their carbon by 1, but the EU increased their carbon by 1. So in total for the world, not extra carbons. Because the one reduction is the one increase in production for the EU. In terms of food, what has happened? 6 food are extra produced by the Kenya, but in terms of the EU, to produce that one extra chemical, they had to give up 4 foods. So in total, there are 2 extra food now produced. So what Kenya could do is say, okay, for that 1 carbon you're giving me, we will give you the 4 food that you're losing. Meaning Kenya now lands up with this 2 extra food in the world. Yes, there could be other discussion of how much we're going to trade it and that, and then maybe Kenya decides, okay, since we're producing 6 food and you're losing 4 food to produce this 1 carbon that we don't actually want to produce, but we want you to produce it, we can give you maybe 5 food. And then they give 5 food to the EU. So even though they lost 4 food, they are gaining 1 food because they're getting 5 food from Kenya. And the same man, Kenya